Welcome to the Troutman Sanders Battery and Storage Podcast. I'm your co-host, Cliff Sikora.
And I'm Bill Durasmo.
Batteries.
Storage.
Podcast. Guests.
Analysis.
Conversation.
Tune in.
Rate.
Review.
Let's go. Welcome to the Troutman Sanders Battery and Storage Podcast. I'm your co-host, Cliff Sikora, although today I am flying solo. My co-host on previous episodes of this podcast, Bill Durasmo, is appropriately socially distant at the moment, and we will work out technical bugs, and we will attempt and we'll hopefully overcome those to be able to bring you a dual host format as we have done in previous episodes. Before getting started, of course, the most important thing for my colleagues at the law firm and my colleagues that help, including Bill, with the podcast, the most important thing, of course, is that everybody stay safe, that everybody abide by restrictions such as they are, and that folks attend to what is the most important thing, which is their health of their family, health of their colleagues, health of their community. And on behalf of my colleagues at the law firm, of course, if you have anyone in your family, community, or friends, circles that are close to you that have experienced illness, or if you have loss in that regard, our sincere well wishes and condolences to the extent appropriate. And truly sorry for those folks who are dealing with those kinds of things. In addition, we also say thank you very much to first responders and everyone out there who is still keeping the gears of society working. Just as a side note as well, we at the firm have a great resource, COVID-19.troutman.com, together with our merger partner, Pepper Hamilton. There's, of course, a huge panoply of complex legal issues out there, and our law firm is handling a number of them in a lot of different areas. And COVID-19.troutman.com, it's a great resource and excellent information, keeping up to date in the various areas that may interest you. With respect to the topic of this podcast, it is unfortunately the impacts of COVID-19 and what I'll call the on-the-ground implications for the business of battery and storage, project deployment, and financing. So let's get right to it. In particular, I'd like to focus on Energy Storage Association, ESA, which has really great up-to-the-minute survey, and they have a sample of 101 representatives from the storage industry, which is probably a darn good sample. And with respect to that, I think there are some really important highlights, and I would put those in the categories of workforce, number one, number two, choke points, and what I'll call kind of how the public interest is affected by those choke points, both upstream and downstream. And then finally, I think there's the category of financial performance regarding expectations for the sector and what actually may come about. So first, with respect to workforce, the ESA says that the storage industry today, by the way, is absolutely no slouch overall when it comes to its impact on employment in the aggregate sector. ESA is saying there's about 60,000 jobs that are accounted for in the storage industry. Of those responding to the survey, 25% say they're going to reduce their workforces, and 75% say, though, that they're going to defer layoffs, but they're going to potentially re-examine that at the end of Q2. And this is also corroborated in a April 8th Energy Storage News report, quoting Key Capture Energy COO Dan Fitzgerald, who says, quote, "Remarkably, during this time, it seems we're busier than ever, and we're effectively working remotely from home. In fact, we're even hiring and onboarding employees remotely. So from a labor market perspective, I think this highlights that there is demand for the specialists in the storage sector, and that shows the long-term buoyancy, I think, of the technology because it has taken hold, and in that respect, there is long-term demand for the skill set, regardless of the fact that there is delay potentially in the revenue accretion for some of the projects, as we'll see in the next segment of the pod. So let's turn to that. As I said, the second major Roman numeral that I would address is what I'll call choke points and the public interest and how that's affected upstream and downstream. And ESA points out qualitatively that there's three main reasons that people are seeing as problems in getting projects done and in getting them finished and getting future ones done. The first one is customer delays and cancellations. Next is difficulty in obtaining equipment, supplies, or logistics, delays therein. And then the next one would be permitting / approval, also public and government inattention and slowdown to getting the projects approved and permitted in the correct capacity. So now as you think about these variables that ESA points out in its survey and its respondents found important, I would split implications into upstream and downstream cleaves, so to speak. So let's talk about upstream. And I think in some respects, the manufacturing in storage in that space is or has been expected to be hit the hardest. Impact on upstream, such as production and manufacturing. And that impact, though, as it seems to be reported, is coming from two places. First would be sort of the lack of downstream funding assurances, meaning impacting upstream manufacturers with advance orders by not placing those advance orders, cancellations of out-of-year orders, and then also customer delays and cancellations, as the ESA points out. But then I think second, impacting those upstream manufacturing sector issues is supply chain related physical disruptions, because there's really no substitute goods for batteries and where they're and how they're manufactured. So first, let's talk about the reduction in advance orders for forward scheduled projects. And that would, in some respects, be based on lack of assurances for revenue in the offtake and uncertainty regarding financing with respect to those projects in some respects. So this is creating, of course, downward pressure on the forward positive outlooks into next year. So take a look at Wood Mackenzie, which is one of the leaders in reporting data on this issue, and the power and renewables. Wood Mackenzie data says sort of what ESA says, and they're focusing on forward CapEx. So what they are seeing is 20% reduction in aggregate sector predicted megawatt deployments slated nationwide for 2020. And they see the impact hitting hardest on behind the meter with a 32% reduction in megawatts scheduled, which is a lot. And so that would be kind of uncertainty in the forward market for financing advance orders and getting those hardware systems manufactured appropriately to get them deployed in 2 to 3 years. But then second, there's, as I was saying earlier, in the upstream issue, there's what I'll call supply chain matters that have been cited. So again, citing Energy Storage News, there are quotes from Convergent Energy and Power, and the CEO's name is Johannes Rieterhausen, and he says, quote, COVID-19 has slowed battery storage supply chains since the majority of battery cells and solar arrays are built in China. We are also looking closely at the impact on the supply chains for the other system components as manufacturers suspend operations across the world, including here in the United States. And then as well, there was a blog post from Burns and McDonnell EPC energy storage expert Chris Ruckman, who stated that he believes projects are going to eventually move forward, but that project leaders are going to have to face shipping delays and supply disruptions. And what I found interesting about his comments are that he says upstream manufacturers have shifted from making batteries to producing face masks and disinfectant bottles. This is, of course, from his blog post, which I would find interesting. And that means that there are production lines upstream that are reconfigured and, of course, might have to be reconfigured to get back to storage production. From a downstream perspective, backing up what the respondents in the ESA survey reported regarding the difficulty in obtaining equipment and supplies and the logistical delays, Energy Storage News also reported that there are pandemic restrictions that are directly impacting workforce safety rules, and essentially that is impacting construction teams and permitting and consultant work as well. And then as an example of the nexus between manufacturing upstream and performance by contractors on projects downstream, you have a quote by Danny Liu, who is Executive VP for Energy Storage Systems for the manufacturer Powin Energy. And he essentially is saying that he had problems performing in early 2020 due to the roll-off effect, the ripple effect of manufacturers in China having a problem with COVID and having ripples in their production. And so the ability of the EPC contractor downstream to perform here was affected by Chinese COVID. That is gradually coming back. But of course, now the supply chain is a critical issue in this sector. So then finally, as I noted, in addition to other downstream issues, we have ESA respondents highlighting what they'll call permitting and approval and public and government inattention and the technical and workforce related issues that a lot of professional and white collar workforces are facing in public relations, in government relations, in legal, in accounting, and all the softer side, so-called non-essential employees. So, for example, there is permitting work being done, but local governments, for example, who are in the thick of it, are resource constrained and are having some difficulties. Then there's questions about what sort of folk in government are considered essential and what contractors are considered essential, what projects are considered essential. But in addition to that, you have a nexus with government approvals and blanket, what I'll call standstills, which seem to be helping in some respects given COVID. So, for example, you have states such as California, New York, and Massachusetts providing freezes April 7th on project milestones that would otherwise put folks in default from a regulatory standpoint regarding project approvals. So April 17th, you've got the Massachusetts Department of Resources. They kind of said projects in the pipeline are going to be grandfathered, and there was a blanket notice of force majeure that was issued by Massachusetts electric companies. And that, in a sense, put a standstill to, from a state's perspective, approvals that otherwise would have been required during that period. So there is a public policy recognition that projects on the solar side, which often involve storage, of course, are going to require a little bit of help on the government approval side to ensure that they keep moving. So as I mentioned, I split the issues highlighted from the ESA survey into workforce, choke points, upstream and downstream, and then finally financial performance. So Kelly Speaks Beckman, CEO of ESA, was quoted as saying that her trade association expects, quote, year-over-year growth by year-end 2020. And with respect to survey respondents from the group, 63% said they expected a decrease in revenues. 33% expected more than a 20% year-over-year revenue decrease. So a little bit of contango there in terms of projections with respect to revenue, but we may be talking about different parts of the business, and I think that might be a bit of a difference because from what I saw, there wasn't a categorization of the 101 respondents, so there may be different parts of the sector that are weighing in. So let's talk about that a little bit. So regarding financial performance, I think I would split that into another three kind of categories. The first one being what I would consider the difference between in the pipe projects, in the pipe CapEx, and we'll talk about that, what that means, versus go forward projects. And if you remember early on, I talked about there being a downward pressure on those go forward projects because of potential lack of downstream assurances on the financing side. But so let's talk about that first part, which is in the pipe projects versus go forward, and what that prognostication looks like. I think the second thing is I think there's a difference out there between what I'll call hybrid projects, which is pairing storage with renewables versus standalone. And then I think finally there is a difference in perception and expectations of investors in publicly exchange traded equities, maybe in stocks, large companies that are in this business, versus private equity, which are not necessarily small, but and have different investment expectations. So let's go through that fairly quickly. Regarding the issue of what's in the pipe versus, quote unquote, the go forward concept, there was a quote from Daniel Finn Foley of Wood Mackenzie Consultant, Power and Renewables, and he's the head of energy storage there. And he said, quote, depending upon how significantly projects are delayed, the impact of COVID-19 could result in hundreds of millions of dollars worth of capacity being moved from 2020 to 2021 and out further potentially toward 2025. So from Wood Mackenzie's perspective, there are issues regarding delays with certain in-the-pipe projects. He sees the capital expenditures being moved and delayed and potentially out several years, even to 2025. Now, with respect to that, I think there's a difference between hybrid and standalone projects. Storage batteries in particular are more and more being coupled with wind and solar, and that's tied to tax equity and the availability of that for renewables. I will attempt to bring experts in on that subject next time or the time after that because I think it's important. But if you are looking at the aspect of on-site storage issues paired with renewables, and that being an integral part of renewable projects being a go-forward concept on hybrid models, which is what FERC wants to look at this summer in the technical conference. You have to look at a major industry trend and how broader equity markets are affected. So Bank of America, for example, Wall Street equity analyst Julian Dumoulin-Smith said earlier this month, he said, quote, "The bottom line is that wind and solar projects are still happening. They're just being delayed from 3Q and 4Q 20 oriented in-service dates. But they, in Bank of America's view, see, quote, limited risks." So with respect to that concept, he is noting broader equity market support for in the pipeline projects. And he also, again, cites tax equity, continued buoyancy for structured finance that is in place and will be committed, but that there are delays in implementation. Now, again, that's on the renewable side. So to the extent that there is storage paired with that renewable, you see that as a hop along and one will follow the other. And I think that overall, then you might see the outlook coming from ESA as being impacted by that in terms of one perspective in the respondents' answers. And so in addition, that highlights what I was saying earlier about what I think might be the difference between the way investors are viewing the storage business and what they're investing in, and that there is no one model for storage. And we've said that a million different times. But so, for example, if you look at what Bank of America is saying regarding equity analysis of exchange-traded equities in this sector on renewables, the question they're talking about is how much structural growth is there going to be, so to speak, in renewables? And then what is going to be there regardless, in some senses, of COVID? And how much is COVID going to create a cycle to bring things down? On what's been baked into the price of the investments that have already been made, essentially, in either the pipe, so to speak, or expectations of what's going to be financed on a go-forward basis. But I found what was very interesting is, in contrast, let's look at private equity and their expectations. So if you look at a quote from Convergent Energy and Power and their CEO, Johannes Rittenhauser, his company was acquired by Energy Capital Partners in June 2019. And so he was recently quoted as saying, quote, "The acquisition provides us with strong financial backing and the resources to continue funding projects throughout the years to come, no matter the economic impact of COVID-19. So although there may be some questions on a go-forward basis about how things will be funded after a roll-off, so to speak, of projects in the pipe, there may be investors that are in certain aspects of the business for the long term. For example, this Energy Capital Partners quote from the CEO of Convergent Energy regarding the way they invested in that company. So thank you for sticking with me on this solo flight for episode 5, the Troutman Sanders Battery and Storage Podcast COVID-related episode. And I hope to have my co-host and other more interesting people along with me for the next iteration. So thanks for sticking with us. Appreciate it. Stay safe.
These recorded materials are designed for educational purposes only. This podcast is not legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the individual participants. Troutman Sanders does not make any representations or warranties, express or implied, regarding the contents of this podcast. Information on previous case results does not guarantee a similar future result. Users of this podcast may save and use the podcast only for personal and other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without the prior written permission of Troutman Sanders.